Hello, historians, and welcome back to your podcast, Unit 8.10, Cold War Cuba, Session 2. Now that we've discussed the Bay of Pigs invasion, let's take a moment to deep dive into this event a little bit more. In just a moment, you'll go ahead and pause the podcast in order to watch video 2 on the Bay of Pigs invasion. As you watch this clip, be sure to actively jot down 3 key takeaways on the side of your margins for your notes. The link for this video can be found in the description section of your podcast. So let's talk about the outcome, meaning what happened at the end of this Bay of Pigs invasion. We can see Cuba is located here in the Caribbean. We can see, according to this map, where the invasions were launched from. So we can see that from Florida, these exiles landed in Guatemala, traveled to Nicaragua, and then from Nicaragua ultimately launched the invasion on the Bay of Pigs area of Cuba. And another invasion by these exiles was also launched from the islands off the coast of Puerto Rico into Cuba. Castro somehow was able to find out about this secret Bay of Pigs invasion. And because Castro knew the attack was coming, he was able to prepare for this attack. And because he was prepared, right away, he was able to defeat these U.S.-supported exiles. Now, because he was able to defeat this Bay of Pigs invasion attack, he was not only able to kill several of these Bautista supporters, several of these capitalist supporting exiles, he was also able to take a lot of them captive as prisoners and held them in prison for about a year and a half. And we can see these exiles here. Remember that they are capitalists, they are supporters of the dictator Fulgencio Batista, and because they're capitalist and because they support Fulgencio Batista, they're pretty much Castro's enemies, which is why he has them killed or imprisoned. Now, because the Bay of Pigs invasion failed in pretty much every way possible, it's known as the perfect failure. And this perfect failure was a huge embarrassment for the United States, especially because it was very obvious to the entire world that this Bay of Pigs invasion had not only been created and supported and funded by the United States, but it was very obvious that the United States was trying to kind of cover up their involvement. It was no secret how much involvement the United States had in this. Now, when the USSR finds out about this Bay of Pigs invasion and how much the United States was involved in this, the USSR immediately sends its top secret advisors to Cuba. These advisors are going to go into Cuba in order to help Fidel Castro build up a plan to protect itself from any further United States planned invasions. And so what we're going to find is that the failure of the Bay of Pigs is going to lead to a huge crisis. And the huge crisis is atomic missiles are going to be placed in Cuba. Khrushchev, the leader of the USSR, decides that one of the ways to best protect the Soviet Union's territory in Cuba and the Soviet Union's communist control of Cuba is by placing atomic missiles in Cuba. Now, remember, Cuba and the Soviet Union are allies, and so, of course, Fidel Castro is going to openly allow the Soviet Union to come in and allow them to place missiles there. Now, these missiles in Cuba, if you haven't already guessed, they're going to be aimed directly at the United States. Remember that Cuba is right next to the U.S., and so these missiles there are a perfect protection, not only for Cuba, but a perfect protection for the USSR's goal of spreading communism during the Cold War. So let's take a look at the following reasons as to why missiles are placed in Cuba. Number one, like I've already mentioned, to offer protection to Castro against the U.S. The second reason is to get payback on the United States. Something that the United States did at the very beginning of the Cold War was it created the Truman Doctrine. And if you remember, the Truman Doctrine was America's containment plan. The containment plan to stop communism from spreading and to also help countries avoid communism. And specifically, the Truman Doctrine focused on helping Greece and on helping Turkey fight off communism. When the United States created the Truman Doctrine and when the United States started visiting Greece and Turkey, one of the things the United States did during this time period was that they placed atomic missiles and bombs in Turkey. And these atomic missiles and bombs were facing the Soviet Union. And so at the very beginning of the Cold War, the United States is going to use Turkey as a strategic launching point for atomic missiles in case the U.S. feels it has to launch an attack on the Soviet Union. Now, the interesting thing about these missiles here in Turkey is that only the U.S. and only the USSR knew about these missiles. This is something super important to remember, and I would actually go ahead and circle this and put a little star next to this key point, because these missiles in Turkey and the fact that only the U.S. and USSR knew about them, this is going to be a key point we're going to discuss later in the lecture. Now, how does the U.S. find out about these Soviet atomic missiles in Cuba? Well, we find out because we were actually spying on the Cubans. We had been flying many different spy planes over Cuba after the Bay of Pigs invasion. We were flying these spy planes because we knew that since the Bay of Pigs invasion had failed, we knew that Fidel Castro and we knew that Nikita Khrushchev from the USSR, we knew that they were probably planning something against the US. And so we started sending all of these spy planes over the Cuban territory, and these spy planes were able to take pictures of Cuban territory that appeared to have missiles being built on it and that appeared to be having missile launch pads installed. This was a super huge red flag for the United States, because if we take a look at this bottom picture, pretty much now John F. Kennedy has the power to launch a missile by clicking a button. This missile will be launching from Turkey into the Soviet Union. And the leader, Nikita Khrushchev, also has a missile. This missile is located in Cuba, and he has the power to also click that same button in order to launch a missile against the U.S. So pretty much we see these two leaders during the Cold War pretty much are kind of playing like a wrestling game to see who will launch their missile first against the other one. Let's take a look at where these missiles are located. We can see here Cuba in the Caribbean, and we can see that the Soviet Union had four main launch areas. These launch areas, again, if you take a look at them, are directly geared towards the United States, specifically the eastern and the southeastern coast of the U.S. The United States, with the spy planes, were able to use mathematical calculations, and based on the mathematical calculations, they found that the Soviet missiles in Cuba could easily destroy the following key locations: New York, Washington, D.C., Chicago, Atlanta, Seattle, Denver, and Los Angeles. These key cities, if destroyed, this would just completely detriment and cause chaos in the United States. Now, not only could American key cities be destroyed, but also Mexico City could be destroyed. If Mexico City were to be destroyed, the Soviet Union and the Cubans could easily launch an attack on Mexico, conquer all of Mexico's territory, and then make Mexico a communist country. And so these missiles are super, super scary, because these missiles could lead to many American cities being destroyed, but could also lead to communism spreading into Mexico. Let's go ahead and pause here in order to assess your understanding of some of the items we've just talked about. Individually, you're going to complete the Show You Rock section 2 by deciding if each statement is true or false. We're not going to go over the answers for this Show You Rock section, but this is a great place to see whether or not you're fully meeting today's objective. Go ahead and pause the podcast in order to complete the Show You Rock section now. Welcome back to the podcast. Now that we've talked about these missiles in Cuba, let's go ahead and see if you can make a couple predictions, meaning a couple guesses about what these missiles might lead to. Independently, you're going to complete sentence starters 1 and 2 before moving on to the next slide. Sentence starter 1 says, I think that the U.S. will or will not react to these missiles in Cuba because. Sentence starter 2 says, given Kennedy's reaction, if I were in Khrushchev's shoes, I would feel blank because. Kennedy's reaction is going to be the reaction that you think will take place. So if you think Kennedy will not react, based on Kennedy not reacting, how do you think Khrushchev will feel and what do you think he will do? If you believe that Kennedy will react, then based on the fact that Kennedy is going to react, how do you think Khrushchev will feel? What do you think he will do and why? Go ahead and take the next couple seconds to pause your podcast, answer these 2 prediction questions, and then move on to the next slide when you're ready. All right, so let's see what actually happens during this missile crisis. We know that these missiles are placed in Cuba, and therefore the fact that these missiles are located in Cuba is going to be known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Go ahead and annotate the word starts into your notes because we're going to talk about what happens when this crisis starts. Kennedy, the U.S. president, who we can see here, announces that the U.S. will see any missiles launched by Fidel, the Cuban leader, as Khrushchev's fault, meaning that Kennedy lets the entire world know that even though these missiles are located in Castro's territory, if Castro launches them, the United States is going to hold Nikita Khrushchev fully responsible for these missiles launched because Khrushchev gave these missiles to Castro. The U.S. decides to also take some action against these missiles. And the action is to launch a naval quarantine, meaning a naval blockade on Cuba. If we take a look, we can see this naval quarantine here. Cuba is located here in the Caribbean. There are 4 key missile sites from which Khrushchev and Fidel Castro can launch these missiles. And all around Cuba, we can see this green dotted line. This green dotted line represents America's naval quarantine blockade. A quarantine blockade basically means that U.S. ships were placed all around Cuba in order to block anyone from getting into Cuba and in order from blocking anyone of getting out of Cuba. This is very similar to the trade embargo. The only difference is that during the trade embargo, there weren't necessarily ships all around Cuba. During the trade embargo, it was pretty much the United States saying no one comes into Cuba to trade. During this quarantine blockade, the United States has actually physically placed ships all around Cuba. The goal of this naval quarantine blockade is to stop more weapons from being placed in Cuba. Now, the USSR is furious that the United States has placed a naval quarantine blockade on the Soviet Union's Cuban ally. And so what Nikita Khrushchev does is Nikita Khrushchev contacts JFK and he lets JFK know, if we take a look at the map here, he lets JFK know that Soviet ships are going to be sent over to the quarantine to break the quarantine up. JFK and Nikita Khrushchev are pretty much now coming close to creating the first physical contact between American soldiers and Soviet soldiers. Thus far, during the Cold War, American soldiers and Soviet soldiers have not physically come into combat. There has not been any physical combat in Germany, in China, in Vietnam, in Korea. There has not been any physical combat between Soviet and American soldiers yet. And during this particular part of the Cold War, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, it appears that for the first time in Cold War history, there might actually be some physical combat and contact between American and Soviet soldiers. The podcast is about to end. Go ahead and find session 3 to continue the rest of your notes.